Coming up next on the SPNN Forum, we have Tricia Heuring, Artistic Director and Senior Curator at Public Functionary. Hi, I'm Martin Ludden, Executive Director at the St. Paul Neighborhood Network. We are here in the Kwame McDonald studio at SPNN with Tricia Heuring, Artistic Director and Senior Curator at Public Functionary. And Tricia, welcome to the forum.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about what Public Functionary is?
Yeah, so Public Functionary is an arts organization. We're a 501c3, but that's very recent. That's only been for the last year or so. So we really operated as a grassroots sort of collective arts organization, figuring out what it is and what it meant to the community for probably 10 years. But what it does is create space, particularly for artists of color and for very early career emerging artists to try to understand what it means to have an artistic practice, to build community around that practice, and to present new work, really adding to the arts and cultural landscape in the Twin Cities. There's a lot of different ways that we do this work. That's very broad, but at the core, we are an arts organization, and we're working to make the Twin Cities really a thriving place for artists.
So over those 10 years, more than 10 years, what did it look like then, and what does it look like now, and how's that different?
Yeah, so let's see. It's so funny when you're looking back 10 years. It's interesting because I remember looking at other arts organizations when I was first getting started and looking at executive directors and reading about them and that they had been at it for 10 years or 15 years or, you know, the Soap Factory was around forever, Juxtaposition Arts, like Intermedia Arts, all of these organizations had long legacy histories, and I was just like, how do they do that? And here I am, you know, over 10 years later. But it started out because I was a curator, a young curator, trying to find community and trying to figure out how to work in the visual arts. I always knew that I wanted to curate, and when I had moved here, so I didn't grow up in Minnesota. I moved here for college, and I actually lived in Egypt. So I was fortunate to have this sort of privilege of a very international upbringing in which my community was very diverse, and I was surrounded by a lot of different people of a lot of different backgrounds. When I came to Minnesota, it was not that way, at least not in the late 90s, early 2000s, or at least I couldn't find that community. And growing up in different countries, moving around a lot, I really watched my mom create community, and the way she did that was by inviting people into our home and cooking for them and taking care of them and just like creating hospitality. And so, you know, paralleling that with my experience of going to art galleries and trying to see myself as a curator in those spaces, they felt very cold, they didn't feel very welcoming, they felt very intimidating. And so that was really at odds for me. And so I thought, well, if I could create space, if I could create a gallery space, I would want it to be welcoming, I would want it to be warm. And it's interesting because 10 years later, we're really in the middle of this conversation around a lot of things like, you know, spaces that are BIPOC-led, diversity, inclusion, you know, equity, all of these things. I had none of that language 10 years ago, but I knew that I did not feel included in the spaces that existed, and I knew that those spaces didn't reflect me. So kind of fumbling along with a lot of really cool creative collaborators, we ended up with a space in Northeast Minneapolis that was about 2,500 square feet. I was interested in Northeast because I lived in the neighborhood. And I really find a responsibility to the impact that art spaces can have. So if you put an art space in a neighborhood, it will inevitably change that neighborhood in different ways. It will bring people to that space. And so for me, having a space in the neighborhood that I lived in was important. So that's why we ended up there. It was not as like, right now it's a super trendy, everyone wants to kind of be in Northeast. 10 years ago, everyone was like, you're trying to do this in Northeast? So I was like, yes. So we started this space, we didn't really know what we were doing, and it led to 6 years from that starting point of really just DIY 101. Like, how do we do an art space? How do we make it work? And the best way that made sense to me was to invite folks in. Like I said, the way my mom did, make people feel welcome, say yes to their ideas, support them in what they wanted to create. And the space, truly evolved over time into a place that a lot of different communities felt welcome. Yeah. So I feel very fortunate as a curator to have been able to start a space that allowed me to learn what it meant to be a curator, but also created space for others like me who didn't feel like they had that space. Yeah. I was really learning on the go, as were my collaborators, and when people started using the space, they showed us what it should be. And I think that today, Public Functionary really is a reflection of the ways in which community have used that space. Yeah.
How did you support the work in the early stage? Like, because you had like a 2,500 square foot studio, and like, how did that work?
So we had a space, and it had rent that was due every month. Yeah. And that was it. Like, we had to pay the rent and the insurance, the bills on that space, and we just sort of like hobbled it together. It was sort of like renting the space, selling some artwork, collaborations with other arts organizations. Like a larger arts organization would have a grant, and they would be like, we'll use your space and we'll give you part of the grant to co-produce that with us. Myself and my co-director Mike Bishop at the time were working a million other jobs. Yep. It's a classic story. It's the classic art hustle story. But worked, I was teaching at one point. I was teaching at 3 different universities as an adjunct.
And that's super lucrative and stable.
Oh, yes. Yeah. But, I look fondly on my years as an adjunct. Everything I did was really informing the work at Public Functionary. Teaching at MCAD at the University of Minnesota, working as an art consultant, doing independent consulting. I worked quite a bit with Forecast Public Art. I still do. Yeah. Doing some art consulting. So I really taught myself how to make ends meet. There were definitely months where we paid the rent on the gallery before our personal rent. Yeah. You just kind of make sacrifices. We didn't know if we were going to make it. There were so many years where it was like, I don't know how we do this, but we were really like just hopelessly devoted to the space. And what happens is every time you see those gatherings, every time you see people come together, especially folks who don't feel welcome in other spaces, the artist careers that I saw get a platform to launch, the connections that people made, like that continued to just fuel the work. And about 8 years into our history, we started to hit that stride of being able to get the grant funding, being able to write the proposals the right way. Individual donors came through. Our various revenue streams just started to start to sustain. We got some different opportunities to do cohorts and just kind of weave into that space of support that is feasible in the Twin Cities, but hasn't always been accessible to organizations led by folks of color. Yeah. So I faced a lot of barriers, but a lot of change was also parallel happening in the Twin Cities. There's a lot of amazing arts organizers and folks who have been pushing for change. Yeah. And so really staying with it and also being involved in that myself put us in the right position to be able to sort of model the change that we need to see in the Twin Cities to make our organization sustainable as well.
Well, and it makes, you talk about being a curator. Like I think people think about, you're curating a visual art gallery or what have you, but like you've curated a space, and like that. So the training on that carries, I would guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard for me to separate my work at Public Functionary from the work that I've really been doing in the last 10 years in the Twin Cities, just in other contexts as well. Working, like I said, at universities. I was on the board of the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council for 6 years and working through leadership transition there. Yeah. Definitely have been involved in a lot of different committees and different roles to try to figure out how to make change in other parts of the sector as well. And so, I'm always interested in what my role is as a curator, not just sort of putting together a space and putting artworks on the wall, but also making connections across, this work broadly. Yeah.
Well, and sitting in all those, different seats, like it gives you the view to what the community needs. And you get to see like, okay, we don't have this. How do we get it?
Yeah, exactly.
And so you've gone now from that one studio, and you've moved, I think, and now you have a lot of space.
So an explosion, a space
Yeah.
explosion happened. And, you know, a lot of the work at Public Functionary has been very fluid. I'm starting to become a lot more organized with planning out for years. Like, as of right now, we know the future of Public Functionary probably out till 2026. But there were times when I had no idea what was going to happen a month later.
Yeah.
But around in 2019, we decided that we really needed to get a bigger space. So those square feet that we had were not meeting the need. We were bursting at the seams. Like we really couldn't scale up. And sometimes to scale up, you have to sort of stop operations. It's like we can't keep going on this track and also imagine how to grow.
Right.
So my co-director at the time and I decided that we were going to close the space. And this was a really big decision, but we were just like, how are we going to get a bigger space unless we just take a minute to strategically plan and figure out what this looks like? So we made the decision we were going to close the space. We also had, at the time, enrolled in Art Space's immersion cohort.
Yeah.
And so Art Space was bringing together organizations through this sort of cohort opportunity to learn what it means to operate space and how you monetize that space, whether you buy a space, whether you rent a space, just that type of thing. So we were in that cohort. We knew we were going to close. A young artist, Leslie Barlow, came to me, and she had done a lot of work with Public Functionary in the past. Her and I had sort of a curator, artist, mentor, mentee sort of relationship, and she had a studio in the Northrup King Building. And she approached me with an idea because the owner of the Northrup King at that time had a studio space available on the 4th floor, and it was rather large. And so she told Leslie, you know, I know you haven't felt like you've had a lot of community in this building. Yeah. Northrup King has historically been older artists, white artists, not super diverse. It's just been hard for folks to access that space or understand how to get a studio, how to afford a studio, all of it.
Yeah.
And so the owner at the time told Leslie, I'll give you the space at sort of a discounted rate, a trial period. You could fill it with a lot of young artists and sort of start a program. So Leslie loved the idea, but knew as an individual artist she couldn't do it alone. Right. So she came to us, was like, does Public Functionary want to partner? And I was like, yes, this sounds amazing for me. Like, it would mean a lot to work with artists in that way. We're closing our space, so this will make it feel like we're not closing.
So this happened, like, you had decided to close, and then this happened.
Yes.
That wasn't like a co-happening.
We decided to close, and then Leslie approached with this idea, and I was like, this is perfect timing.
Right, there it is.
So let's close this space. Let's focus on a studio space, which is still a space, but it's different because it's not going to be public, which was actually super fortunate because, as you know, 2020 was a whole thing.
What was that?
So, you know, pandemic rolls in, and we are just so grateful to the universe for pushing us in the direction of closing a public-facing space. Yeah. We would have gone under. Yeah. Like, if we were still operating that space and in our lease, I don't know, because everything just shut down, you know? Yeah. And we were month to month, so we were operating that way. Yeah. So it was very fortunate. And then during the pandemic, that studio space became very imperative for the artists that were in it. We had done an open call. We had filled the space with 9 young artists. Leslie, myself and Mike had started really like shaping that program. We brought Leslie on as a program director, and we're like, this is going to be an official program of Public Functionary. We've never really had something that formalized, so it felt like a good time to bring in another leadership role. Yeah. She was super excited about it. And we focused our attention to just really cultivating that space for the artists. And from 2019 to about 2022, the space went from 1 space to 5 spaces. Because, you know, the need was so great and the value to the artists was amazing. And so more artists wanted to join. The artists who were in the original program didn't want to leave. Right. So a lot of different things sort of just led to us expanding and growing the program. Yeah. And so now that is the studio program, just to break it down, is what we consider sort of an access point to the Northrup King Building for young artists, particularly artists of color, trans, non-binary, queer artists, artists who generally wouldn't feel like they could access that building. There is power in having like-minded community that you can relate to when you're in a larger space that doesn't reflect you, sort of like a small pod within that.
Yep.
And then also just like what it takes to build up to paying your rent on a studio space.
Yeah.
And so having a supportive structure that allows you to sort of graduate into a more sustainable practice is really important. Like there can be buildings of art spaces out there that say, we're affordable studio space for marginalized artists. But what does that mean?
Yep.
Like other than, oh, the rate is market rate.
Yeah.
Or the rate is lower than that building.
Yeah.
That's not, that isn't actually a supportive program.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more barriers to actually sustaining a studio practice when you're a young artist who hasn't ever had that kind of support before.
Well, and that's, I mean, part of, I think part that's missing from a lot of arts education is like, okay, like you can draw, you can paint, you can sculpt, whatever. Here's all the other stuff you have to do in order to keep having that practice and having a space to have that practice
Absolutely.
and doing that whole thing.
Yes, yeah. So that's the other part of the program. We do workshops, mentorships. We have a conversation lab program where the artists are able to bring ideas and get feedback. We do workshops on writing grants, on pricing their work, on packaging their work. There's a number of exhibition opportunities for the artists. So they get an opportunity to see what it would be like to exhibit their work and have, the support structure in place to do that. We also have a residency program in Grand Marais that artists can apply to, but we sort of shape it as by applying to this internal residency program, you learn the process of applying to an artist residency.
Right.
What does it mean to go away for a week and have unstructured time to dedicate to your practice?
Yeah.
Residencies are a really key thing to artists, like propelling their career. But unless you went to grad school, or even, I don't even know if undergrad really teaches it, an artist would have no idea.
They
like,
don't.
Oh, okay, great, a residency. How do I apply for that? What would I do with that time?
Yeah.
How does that actually propel my career? So
Right.
it's sort of like a PF Studios program is sort of like experimental everything that you might want to try in the art world. You could try it through the program first.
I feel like there's a whole nother conversation to be had about sending PF artists to Grand Marais, because like so like you've made your mark in the Northrup King Building. Like Grand Marais feels like a whole nother frontier.
Yeah, well, it's in February, so it's in the dead of winter,
Oh, man.
and it's really amazing. Leslie actually goes up with the artists, so the program director and 6 artists go up to the frozen tundra it's 10 days now, and they really love it. It's really good, but that's another thing is like for artists of color to have access to an artist residency in a rural Minnesota area. How do we make that happen as well? Like how do we give access to all of the things, nature in the winter, and all the things that most artists in Minnesota have access to.
Right. Yeah. So as you're curating these programs, like are you curating with an eye to not identity specifically, but are you looking at the who? Are you looking at the what? Are you looking at some combination thereof to kind of build out this community?
I think that, well, in terms of the program, when we're looking at artists applying to the open calls, we're looking at, what is their dedication to their practice?
Right.
What potential is there for them to build a practice? What barriers have they faced in the past? There's a lot of artists who are really excellent, but we can look at their application and say they could get a studio elsewhere.
Right.
Or they would have an opportunity, or they've had opportunities. So we're really trying to think about like where are the barriers and who are the folks that could use this the most.
Yeah.
There's like an income limit and things like that. So I think it's really about just trying to make sure that those that need it the most are able to get access, but then also having the right balance of artists. So what types of practices do they have? What disciplines are they working in? Like we work with the artists who are currently in the program to choose the next artists.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's the best way to do that is to have those that are going to be, in collaboration. So they review them and they think about, this person's practice really parallels with this person's, or this person might actually bring a different perspective in. So it's curated in that way to think about the type of community that's being created. But we also have fashion designers, and so the disciplines are very broad, and I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, and it's just the having that space to work, with folks that look like you that are interested in similar things, but also to have exposure, as a visual artist to fashion designers, and that there's got to be just an incredible kind of energy and synergy that happens in that space.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it allows you to look at material different and process, you know, when I have definitely seen some of the artists that never worked with textiles start working with textiles, you know, or artists that weren't working in oil be like, oh, could you show me how to do this, you know. We had some artists build a dark room in in one of our small studios, the incubator studio space, because they wanted to teach each other how to use a dark room.
I love that there's still a dark room somewhere.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a lot of interest in film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So like when someone comes in, what do they see? Like what, you know, is there always work up in the gallery? Are there people, you know, making art? I mean, I suppose you have the different PF studio, physical studios around the building, but. Yeah,
so if you visit Public Functionary at the Northrup King Building, it's really fun.
We should do that.
We're right off of the main loading dock, so there's an external entrance to our main gallery. So we have two spaces, one above the other, that are sort of our public-facing spaces. On the first floor, you go into the main Public Functionary space, and we have the cafe, which is a partnership. It's called PF Cafe. Ryan Stapera has been heading that up. He has a huge passion for bringing folks together around food. So we have a small cafe. There's a lounge area, and then it opens up into our main gallery, which is a multidisciplinary space. We use that for exhibitions, for performances, film screenings, all different types of events. And that is booked, I mean, pretty much every weekend, every other weekend. There's something going on in the space. If there's an exhibition, it's up longer. If it's a performance, obviously, it's just the weekend.
Right.
But the cafe is open Thursday through Saturday, 9 to 6. So folks can just pop in anytime and see that space. The upstairs has another gallery space that's open Thursday through Saturday for gallery hours. We do have an exhibition up right now by an artist, Jordan Blake Shepherd, who did these beautiful tufted rugs, some textile work up there. So those are the two spaces that you can visit just regularly. During Art-A-Whirl and open studio events and other things that we host, you can do like a studio walk and go visit the artists' studios. So they'll open them up for open studios.
And Art-A-Whirl is coming up. What's the date on that?
I think it's the 19th, 20th, 21st.
And you will be open for...
We'll be open the whole...
For fun and art viewing?
Yeah, we're going to be open the whole weekend, and we're going to be partnering with Tangible Collective. They are an artist collective in the Northrup King Building with us. And so they're putting together Swap Meet, which is an artist market in our upstairs space. And then they're curating projection art in the downstairs space. Cafe will be open all weekend. And then if you come to PF, there's maps that Tangible is creating that take you around, basically show you all the spaces in the building that are related to Public Functionary or are just like friends of ours in the building. So it's sort of like a curated tour within the Art-A-Whirl experience.
Nice. How long has the cafe been a part of the operation?
So the cafe just opened in March.
Okay.
And it's, you know, we always had food and drink at events, and it was something that Ryan was very passionate about. So he's the fourth, you know, I told you about how we brought Leslie Barlow into the team. She started leading the PF Studios program. Ryan came to us in 2020 during the pandemic and had been trying to start a couple other things on his own. He was feeling very isolated in that effort. And just, you know, given our collaborative history, he was like, I would really love to, you know, do this with y'all. I'm really passionate about the food side of this. I don't think anyone's really doing it. And so we just saw the possibility there. There had been a lot of conversation in the Northrup King Building about needing a cafe, a food outlet. And Art Space, who is now the owner of that property, was really supportive of that idea. So
well, and that brings it all the way back around to you know, to bringing people into the space and feeding them and building community.
Well, what happened at the old Public Functionary space, the original space, was that there were always these events and things going on. And so if you were there during the day, you would see some artists coming in, setting up for their event, others packing out, other ones coming to meet with us because they were planning another thing. And so there was just like all this crossover of folks, and that's when you would see people connect and say, hey, let's work on this, or I've never met you before. So we were really thinking about how do we create that more.
Yeah.
You know, how do we have that environment where people can be there all the time and can actually have that exchange and conversation? So the cafe element allows us to be open more and have a reason for people to come. It's more of a cultural hub that's a reliable space.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So if folks want more information about Public Functionary, what's the best place to find it?
Publicfunctionary.org, our website. We always have an updated calendar. If you subscribe to the newsletter, which is at the bottom of the website, you'll get once a month what's coming up this month. There's so many fun There's so much fun programming. It's worth doing that. And then also you can follow us on Instagram, pfunctionary, and we post constantly.
Tricia, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time and for the curating and community building that you're doing. Love it.
Thank you.
We have been here in the Kwame McDonald studio at SPNN for the 900th episode of the SPNN Forum with Tricia Heuring of Public Functionary. Thanks for watching and come back again soon.